All right, space nerds and conspiracy theorists, strap in, because today we're peeling back the curtain on one of NASA's most jaw-dropping, tear-jerking, eyebrow-raising stories, the Apollo mission tragedies. The part of history NASA loves to tuck away in the fine print. You know, the parts where NASA went from, phew, at least there was no crew inside, to, oh, there was a crew inside. But hey, space exploration isn't for the faint of heart. Let's blast off. So, we all know the glamorous part of Apollo. The sleek white rockets, the inspiring speeches, the American flags flapping in slow motion. But what NASA doesn't love to highlight is just how close this entire program came to being a multi-billion-dollar interstellar disaster. Repeatedly. Let's get one thing straight. Space travel in the 60s wasn't some polished sci-fi adventure. It was duct tape, slide rules, and a whole lot of let's hope this doesn't explode. It was humans launching themselves on top of controlled explosions in a race to the moon, where even the slightest miscalculation meant instant death. And, oh boy, there were miscalculations. Take Apollo 6, for example. This was NASA's final test flight before sending actual humans into orbit. The plan was to launch an uncrewed Saturn V, simulate a moon mission, and call it a day. How did this plan fail? The rocket started shaking so violently that NASA engineers invented a new term for it, pogo oscillation. Sounds cute, right? Yeah, not when it means your spaceship is rattling itself apart mid-flight. The vibrations were so intense that chunks of the rocket literally fell off. NASA's response was, we'll fix it later. And then there was Apollo 7, the first crewed Apollo flight. You'd think they'd take it easy, right? Nope. 3 astronauts crammed into a tiny capsule for 11 days where they quickly learned that space flu is a thing. All 3 got sick, stuffed up, and miserable. Imagine being weightless and sneezing inside a helmet. Disgusting. But let's talk about the real price of Apollo, not just the broken rockets or astronaut colds, but the sheer human cost. The truth is, NASA was learning on the fly, and when you're learning how to send people to the moon, that means mistakes. Some of them fatal. Buckle up, because this story's just getting started. All right, it's July 16th, 1969. The world is buzzing, no pun intended, because NASA is about to do the impossible, land humans on the moon. The pressure? Astronomical. The stakes? Even higher. Our guy Buzz Aldrin, who was basically born to be an astronaut with that name, grabs a tiny bowl of crackers and a Bible verse before heading out. Because if you're about to step onto an alien world, you might as well bring some snacks and spiritual backup. Fast forward 4 days. Armstrong and Aldrin are inside the lunar module Eagle, ready to make history. Except, plot twist, NASA's primitive room-sized computer starts throwing a tantrum. Beep, beep. NASA's mission control in Houston collectively panics. This error code? Not in the script. Turns out the computer is overloaded because someone forgot to turn off an unnecessary radar switch. Great. The system is running too many tasks at once, much like when you have 37 Chrome tabs open and your laptop sounds like a jet engine. Now, let's add to the drama. The computer's original landing coordinates would have dropped Eagle into a boulder-strewn death trap. And with only 30 seconds of fuel left, Armstrong makes a gut decision. Forget the computer, he's flying this thing manually. Imagine parallel parking, but instead of a car, it's a multi-million-dollar spacecraft. Instead of a curb, it's the moon. And instead of scraping your tires, you explode on impact. No pressure, Neil. With just 20 seconds of fuel left, Armstrong finds a clear spot and lands. Taking in the barren, otherworldly view, Buzz sums it up in 2 words: magnificent desolation. Meanwhile, Armstrong, who had just defied every possible disaster, manually landing a spacecraft with barely any fuel left, steps onto the surface and delivers a line for the history books. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. A cool understatement from the man who had just pulled off the most daring landing in human history. But their adventure isn't over yet. After 21 hours on the moon, they launch back to the command module, where Michael Collins has been waiting. Alone, orbiting the moon, like the most patient Uber driver in history. Then comes the return to Earth. Everything seems fine until their capsule splashes into the Pacific, and Buzz notices something. His feet are wet. Wait, what? Yep, the module is leaking. After surviving a computer glitch, a near-fatal landing, and the vacuum of space, they're about to drown on Earth. Thankfully, NASA's recovery team arrives in time, fishes them out, and just like that, Apollo 11 makes history. But let's be honest, this whole mission was one big cosmic close call. 4 months after Apollo 11, NASA is back in business. Apollo 12 is locked and loaded, ready to follow in Neil and Buzz's legendary moon boot prints. But there's just one little problem. It's storming. Now, common sense would say, hey, maybe don't launch a massive metal tower full of highly flammable rocket fuel into an active thunderstorm. But this is NASA in the 60s, and they've got a tight schedule, plus a very important guest, President Richard Nixon. Postponing? Not an option. So, launch in 3, 2, 1. The Saturn V ignites, roars to life, and 36 seconds after liftoff, zap! A bolt of lightning strikes the rocket. Then, because one lightning strike isn't terrifying enough, zap! Another one. And just like that, every single electrical system in the spacecraft shuts down. Inside the cockpit, everything descends into pure chaos. The warning lights explode to life like a pinball machine from hell. The crew, Commander Charles Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean, have just enough time to process the fact that they are now hurtling through the atmosphere completely blind. NASA? Also panicking. Ground control scrambles for a solution until flight controller John Aaron, who was officially the coolest head in the room, utters the now famous phrase, "Try SCE to AUX." Most people in the room have no idea what that means. But Alan Bean does. He flips the obscure signal conditioning equipment switch to auxiliary power and bam, the systems reboot. Just like that, Apollo 12 is back in business. Now, you'd think that was their one near-death moment, right? Nope. The problems keep rolling. After surviving an electrified launch, they finally land on the moon, only to realize their camera malfunctions almost immediately. Yep, the first color video feed from the moon? Ruined. Because Bean, in what we'll generously call an oops moment, accidentally pointed it straight at the sun, frying the sensor. Oof. And if that wasn't enough, their engine had issues on takeoff, they lost some film, and, oh yeah, NASA forgot to tell them that their parachutes might not open on the way home. Luckily, they did. But let's be real. Apollo 12 was basically a series of horrible ideas that somehow didn't kill anyone. If Apollo 12 was a disaster movie, Apollo 13 was a full-blown survival thriller. April 11th, 1970. NASA sends up Apollo 13 with astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. It's supposed to be the third moon landing. The crew is feeling good, the mission is going smoothly, and everyone at NASA is confident. Big mistake. 2 days into the mission, the crew casually stirs the oxygen tanks. Boom! A fireball erupts inside the service module, and suddenly, the spacecraft isn't just damaged, it's dying. The explosion cripples the command module Odyssey, wiping out half their power, most of their oxygen, and all hopes of landing on the moon. The crew is now stuck in a tin can, 200,000 miles from Earth. And then comes the now iconic radio transmission. Houston, we have a problem. NASA is in absolute panic mode. The mission has now gone from land on the moon to try not to die in space. The only chance for survival is to move into the lunar module, Aquarius. But the problem is it was designed for 2 people, not 3. Also, it has a limited supply of oxygen. And with the systems down, the crew is stuck in near-freezing temperatures. Fun fact, breathing too much carbon dioxide won't keep you warm, but it will kill you. But NASA, being NASA, MacGyvers the hell out of this situation. Using duct tape, plastic bags, and a manual that probably wasn't meant for life or death origami, they jury-rigged a carbon dioxide filter, keeping the astronauts alive. Oh, and because this mission wasn't stressful enough, Fred Hayes develops a bladder infection. Because when you're crammed in a freezing, malfunctioning spaceship for days on end, why not throw in a medical emergency? After 6 grueling days, the crew finally reaches Earth's atmosphere. But wait, one last problem. NASA has no idea if the heat shield was damaged in the explosion. If it's cracked, the crew burns up on re-entry. The world holds its breath as the capsule plunges into the Pacific. Then, parachutes deploy. Against all odds, Apollo 13 makes it home. No moon landing, no historic flag planting, but arguably the greatest space survival story of all time. Before Neil took his small step, Buzz planted the flag, and Apollo 13 barely made it home, there was Apollo 1. This part of the story isn't inspiring, it's devastating. January 27, 1967. The United States is locked in a space race with the Soviet Union, desperate to put an American on the moon first. Apollo 1 is supposed to be a major step in that direction. The first crewed mission of the Apollo program. Yet the 3 astronauts on board weren't rookies. Gus Grissom is one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. Ed White is the first American to perform a spacewalk. Roger Chaffee is a brilliant rookie pilot, eager to prove himself. Together, they're a dream team. But what should have been a routine pre-flight test turns into a nightmare. The test is called a plugs-out test, basically simulating a launch while the spacecraft remains on the ground. The astronauts are strapped in, running through checklists. No one expects any issues. Then, at 6:31 p.m., it happens. A spark ignites somewhere in the spacecraft's wiring. Normally, this might cause a small flame that is easily contained. But the Apollo capsule is filled with pure oxygen, an environment where even a tiny spark turns into an inferno almost instantly. The fire explodes through its cabin. Gus Grissom's voice is the first heard over the radio.
Fire!
Within seconds, the flames spread across the capsule. The crew fights desperately to escape, but the hatch won't open. Why? Because NASA, in an effort to keep the spacecraft airtight, designed the hatch to open inward. In normal conditions, it's fine. But with the fire consuming everything, the cabin pressure skyrockets, making it impossible to open from the inside. The last words picked up on the radio are believed to be Roger Chaffee's.
We're burning up.
Less than 30 seconds after the fire started, it's over. All 3 astronauts are gone. The country is in shock. Once seen as America's greatest technological triumph, the Apollo program now looks like a reckless gamble. NASA is forced to face hard truths. The investigation reveals serious design flaws, flammable materials inside the cabin, exposed wiring, and a flawed hatch system. Changes that should have been made before the mission. The response: NASA overhauls everything. Every system, every material, every safety measure was reevaluated because failure was no longer an option. The lessons learned from Apollo 1 didn't just shape the next mission, they defined the future of human spaceflight. And that's why Apollo 11 even happened. So, what's the takeaway here? Space is terrifying. It's unpredictable and dangerous, and in NASA's world, one small mistake for man can become one giant disaster for mankind. But despite everything, NASA wants to go back. The Artemis missions are scheduled to return astronauts to the moon by 2026. The question is, would you sign up?